Right, yes, and as you pointed out, what does it mean to have a moral right? What is its origin? Those are very relevant questions to this whole issue. And it seems to me that we can define right, a moral right, as the, you could say, perhaps the privilege to do something in accordance with morality, in accordance with what is morally acceptable to do, which functions as a form of moral shield of your being. This idea of a moral shield, I heard this by a philosopher named Timothy Thiao. It talks also about natural law and human nature and teleology and these things. And he, I think that was an interesting way of talking about it. That is a moral shield to protect you from certain harms or bad things in general. For instance, you have the moral right to own property, because that's a way that you can sustain your life or the life of your family and thereby live a good life on earth. And you have the moral right to sleep and drink and these things. And you have the moral right to marry and start a family. And that also includes having children, because that is in accordance with human nature. And because it is within our human nature to beget children, it is in accordance with our nature to marry and have kids and start families. So I would say that works as an understanding, a good and true understanding of moral rights. And this anti-natalist idea that you don't have the right to bring children into existence because they may potentially suffer, I would say no, it's the opposite, because it is natural for us to beget children. Biologically speaking, we are able to produce them. It's in accordance with our nature. And as we talked about earlier, the purpose of life is to become virtuous and good, and not about alleviating temporary suffering here on earth. So yes, that is what I would say. So morality, the privilege to do something or not do something, works as a moral shield for your being and your journey toward morality or virtue. And its origin it's grounded in human nature, in your teleology, your end to become a virtuous being. Ultimately, I would say it comes from God. But even if we leave aside that question, in a more immediate and direct sense, we see it linked to human nature and our being and our free will. So yes, those are some of the considerations those are things I would say. And we also sort of touched upon it earlier, but yes.
Interesting. Yes, this is now we are deep in the philosophy. That's very cool. So I like particularly one thing that you said, that the origin of a moral right is your human nature. So that, as you said, you have a right to have children because this is what to have children is what all animals do, and human beings are animals, and therefore human beings get children. And because this is a natural thing, then you also have the right to do it. So and this goes with your idea of the moral shield, that basically you don't have to feel bad for doing something which is or later kind of be attacked for doing something which is in accordance with your nature. As you said, you have the right to eat and drink and sleep because these things are essential to your existence as a human being. It's not possible to exist as a human being without doing these things, and therefore you cannot be criticized for doing them. So this moral shield, you could perhaps also say it would be a shield from criticism by others. Would you agree with this synonym?
I wouldn't say criticism, but rather a moral shield from others harming your being and your life. Because you can have a moral right, and that moral right is necessarily an immunity from criticism, or the right to be immune from criticism, but because people can debate you and criticize you there, for instance, but they cannot actually attack your being. Now, perhaps you might say that criticism is a form of harm, but that is, you could say, a separate issue that must be discussed more in that case. Yeah.
No, okay. So you would more see it more like in the physical violence sense, that if you have a moral right to do something, then others don't have, in that sense, they are not then justified in attacking you if you do this thing that is your right.
Yes, it protects you from others lawfully attacking you, you could say, or destroying you in that specific issue.
Yes, I would agree with that definition, because in my mind, or the way I see it, in the end, the origin of rights comes from society. So it's a group of people who come together and live their life together. They interact often, and then at some point or over time, they develop a set of rules by which they say, okay, each one of us will behave according to these rules, and this will allow us to cooperate and to interact. And then these rules basically do exactly what you said. They say, for example, you are allowed to use your own property, and other people are not allowed to attack you if you, or to destroy you if you use this part of matter that we call your property, and also etc. So I think the origin of rights, and I'm not sure if there's a distinction between rights and moral rights, but the origin of rights in general is from society, I would say.
I would say briefly to the question of rights versus moral rights, perhaps it is good to specify moral rights, because some could think of legal rights, rights that you have according to the state, which aren't necessarily what you actually objectively have as a moral right. But I'm not sure, perhaps rights in general can be talked about and people are understanding it as moral right. But anyways, to the other points, I would ask you, would you say that the actual philosophical source of rights is in these societal conventions, or rather that these societal conventions are the means by which we recognize moral rights?
That's a very good question. That's a very good question. I'm not sure. I think that there is a human nature, and human beings, simply by the fact that they are human beings, have certain properties. And these certain properties then lead to certain ways of life that are actually possible for human beings in the long term, and many other ways of life which are not possible for human beings. So they will either die or change their way of life, because it's not possible to exist as a human being in this way for a long time. And so in that sense, I think that there are certain criteria for rights. This is, I think, the idea of natural law, that there are certain rules that a society can formulate that are in accordance with human nature, and these are then the good or the right rules or rights. And then there are other rules or rights that a society can formulate which are not in accordance with human nature, and these would then be bad or corrupt or something like that. So in that sense, I would say that the true moral norms or rules come from human nature, but the origin of rights as they exist in the world comes from society. Because as you said, a right is a shield for me that I can do something or not as I please, and other people are not then justified in attacking me for it or destroying me. And this mechanism comes from society. It doesn't come from human nature, because human nature cannot enforce something.
And those are interesting thoughts and points that you talked about there. I would say that I can start with the natural law would, as you pointed out, be understood as objective facts about human nature and what is necessary for human beings to flourish, and what does it mean for a human being to flourish, what virtues are proper to human nature, etc. And rights would, philosophically speaking, be introduced in the sense that, or in the situation or consideration that we human beings, we exist, we have this nature, and we have this end or goal, natural end or goal, which means that this is the version of ourselves which we strive toward according to our nature, to become a good human being. Like we discussed last time a bit about teleology, that a virtuous knife, according to Aristotle, would be a knife that cuts well. A virtuous human being would be a human being which acts properly according to his nature, which fulfills his nature. And that would be a human being which is healthy and prudent and courageous and patient and temperate, etc. And rights are thus these moral shields which protect you in this quest for reaching that state of virtue and goodness. So while you are on that quest, you are striving toward it, these rights are thus these shields which protect you along the way, you could say. And you could say that rights becomes real when there are social considerations. Because if there are no other human being, you are living entirely by yourself, you could say that the rights become empty in a sense, because yes, you still have this morality, because you yourself has this duty to become virtuous, but these moral shields becomes empty if there are nothing to protect you from others attacking that right. However, you could still say that those rights exist in the sense that it is acceptable for you to exercise those rights. For instance, let's say you live in a forest, completely absent from any society, isolated, and you build a hut. You could say that you have the moral right to build that hut in order to live there, though there are no other human beings around to potentially attack that right. You would still say that I have the right to build that hut because it is proper to my human nature, etc. So I suppose I would say that rights are relevant even then, but it becomes it has an even stronger meaning when the potentiality of others potentially attacking it becomes relevant, which is in a society.
Interesting. So if I think these are good points that you brought up here. So you could perhaps say, or you can say if this is what you are saying, that the first actuality or the origin of a right comes from human nature, but the second actuality or then the right actually comes into existence in a society, because then there are other people around who can or cannot respect this right. So you would have the right even if no society is around, because the right kind of comes from your human nature. As you said, you have the right, for example, to build a hut. And if we would just assume this for the moment, you would not have the right to kill yourself, because that would go against your human nature, which is to live as a human being. But then if a society exists, then these rights are not only just kind of existing in theory, but they are now active in practice.
Perhaps I would at least say that those rights, even in a scenario where you are in complete isolation, they are based on truths about what is lawful for you to do and not do. And you could say that it gains another meaning, in that it becomes a right which separates you in a sense from others potentially doing something. Perhaps in a sense you could say that, because now if you live in a society, there is the potential of others, say, depriving you or stealing your property, your hut, for instance. Let's say someone goes and destroys your hut. If you're living in a society with that hut, you could say that right now gains a stronger meaning, because now it is in opposition to what is actually happening. You see a violation of that right, or the potential of a violation of that right. Perhaps I would say that when you live in a society, a right not only exists in relation to you having the lawful right to do something and not do something, but it also binds others. A right is also related to other human beings having the duty to respect those rights. So if you live alone in a forest and you build a shelter, that right is true objectively, but it has relevance for you alone. But if you live in a society, now everyone in that society is related to that right somehow, because they all have this at least implicit duty to respect it. Do you understand my point?
Mm-hmm. I understand your point. There is something that I would like you to clear up, because I think this is difficult. So you said that rights always are based on truth about what is lawful to do for you or not to do. And I think the term lawful is, for me, difficult in this scenario, because or in the way you use it here, because law, in my mind, there is this distinction between rights and laws. And the rights is what we have talked about up until now, that come from human nature, or perhaps come from society. But the law is clearly something which, in my mind, comes from society. So law is these like sentences that human beings have written down, saying you are allowed to do that or you are not allowed to do that. And the law can or cannot be in accordance with natural rights, or what some people called natural law, which would be what I have said as these rules of action or interaction which actually allow a human being to live as a human being. So yeah.
Right. So when I say lawful, I mean something being morally acceptable, which is in accordance with morality, you could say. So when I'm talking about law there, that would be, I suppose you could say, the natural law or the moral law, which are another way of saying principles about what is morally acceptable for you to do and not to do, which is based on human nature.
Okay, so you basically use the terms a little bit opposite from the way I use them. So you would say the law or the moral law comes from human nature, and then what then is rights?
Right. So rights would be And that's a good question about the specific definition, but at least I would say that those are based on moral truths or what is morally lawful to do. So I'm not entirely sure of the specific definition, but it would be a moral shield, as we talked about, and based on those lawful truths. I'm not sure if that helps your questioning, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think perhaps, I don't know if this video will be then released in the end, but still it's an interesting discussion, and I myself, I feel like we haven't satisfyingly defined it yet. I think it's still a little bit vague or confused with different terminology that we haven't fully defined yet. So I don't exactly know how to continue from here, but because we have talked about human nature, law, natural law, rights, natural rights, that a right can be true or good in the sense that it comes from human nature, or let's call it a societal rule can also be false in the sense that it actually goes against human nature or hinders you from leading a life according to your nature. And then we have also talked about that something can be lawful if you are just by yourself, like you alone in a forest, that there are still moral rules which come from your human nature. So for example, it's okay for you to build a hut, but not okay to kill yourself. And then these rights or something can also act as a shield against other human beings in a social scenario. So yes, I think these are the things that we've talked about, but I'm not quite happy yet with the structure and the terminology. It's not so clear yet.
Yes, that is understandable. But I could just say briefly that one thing about rights, I would say, is that if you live alone with no other human being in existence, for instance, hypothetically, the right would exist as some moral shield which protects you in your quest for becoming a good, virtuous human being. But when there are other human beings in existence as well, if you live in a society, say, then that right would not only be relevant for yourself, but it would bind everyone else, because whenever there exists another human being, that human being immediately has the duty to respect your rights. So yes, that is an interesting thing, or a thing I would say is relevant to this discussion about rights.
Yes, okay, I like that. So you are saying basically can we perhaps just for the moment call it a moral rule? So a moral rule exists as a moral shield for me in my quest towards being becoming a good human being. So I know if I follow this, or if I do not violate this rule, then I will not place upon me any guilt that I acted like a bad human being.
Well, I wouldn't say that rule is precise enough, because a moral rule can also be understood as a duty. But duties and rights they have a connection, but they're not identical to each other.
Yes, yes. I understand your point. So a right would be, as you said, more a privilege or a way of acting which is open to you without doing something immoral. So it's basically a moral shield that says inside of this circle you can do what you want and it's okay.
Yes, you could say it that way, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yes, good point with the rights and the duties. And then you said further that if now other human beings are around as well, then this same right simultaneously acts as this this circle for me, and also as it also affects the other person. So for the other person, it basically says you should not hinder me from acting within this circle, else you would do something bad.
Yes, or else you would do something immoral.
Yes. So it would be, in that sense, my moral right to do something would be your moral duty to not hinder me from doing this.
Right, yes. And you could say that makes the idea, the nature of a right interesting, in that it also becomes a duty whenever there are other human beings. So that's interesting to think about.
And so this is, so basically you would say then that the origin of a right is the human nature, and what a right is kind of two things. It's, on the one hand, it's a moral shield for myself. So it says you have the freedom in this area to do what you want, and still being a morally good or a good human being. And at the same time, it would also tell other people that they do not have they do not have the right of hindering me, or they have the duty not to hinder me. How would you formulate that?
That's a good question. I was thinking about they have the duty to respect the right, but perhaps some would say that to say duty would be a strong word, because it's not an active thing that you have to do, but rather simply not attacking the right.
Yes, you would just have to say they do not have the right to hinder me inside this circle.
Right, yes.
Because then that would mean if they do so, then it would be morally wrong.
Yes. Yeah, they have the right not to attack that right of yours, but it's even stronger than that, because not only do they not, they do not have the right to disrespect that right. Yes. Because then I agree, I understand. Yes.
Okay. And so if we go with this definition, which we have now worked out, then you could answer this question, for example, from the antinatalists very easy, because you would say, what gives you the moral right to put children into this world? And the answer would be my human nature, because it's natural to human beings to have children, like all animals. And then what is this right? Well, this right means that I can freely choose to have children or not to have children without thereby being a bad human being.
Right, because it is in accordance with your human nature.
Yes, exactly. And from the same point, you could then also say that this liberal idea of autonomy, where we started, this idea that because my mind governs my body, and therefore liberals conclude that you now have the right or the moral right to do with your body whatever you want, that would therefore be wrong, because the moral right doesn't come from your mind, but it comes from your human nature.
Yes, or is based upon and restricted by your human nature.
Yes, and that would, at least then we would come back to this point, can it be that something promotes something which destroys itself. So can human nature give a right which destroys its own existence, or it's not the existence of human nature, but the existence of this instance of this person? Or can this not be?
So to that, I would say that it is impossible for it to be right, because you cannot have the moral right to annihilate your own human nature, because the point of morality is to promote your human nature, and to annihilate it is the exact opposite.
Yes, exactly, because we have also, I think in our last conversation, touched on this, that the point of morality is actually to develop yourself into a good human being, or to fulfill or to actualize your potential or your nature. So morality is kind of the guideline which leads you to this end. And therefore, if you would have a moral principle that says it's okay for you to end your life, then it would go against this purpose of actualizing your potential and becoming a good human being.
Right, yes. The point of morality is to actualize the virtuous goodness that you're supposed to become according to your nature, and therefore you can never have the right to destroy all of that.